There we go. Okay, got it recording. So welcome everyone. We are joined by Phyllis Leffler today, Professor Emerita at UVA and a member of CBI, with her presentation, Jews as Insiders and Outsiders, CBI, White Supremacy and Antisemitism. Actually, it's not just a presentation, it's really an interactive talk. So she'll be talking with us and then leading us in discussion as well. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to Phyllis.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I really want to start out just by thanking the Social Justice Initiative group for hosting this series of conversations. I think it is so important for us as a community to be having these discussions, to be thinking about, in this case, the role that Jews in the past, people we might consider our forebears in this city, what role did they play in terms of the life of the city? And that's in part what I hope to talk about tonight, just focusing on a couple of moments in time and trying very hard not to take up the entire time so that we will, in fact, be able to have a discussion. So in the interest of doing that, I am going to share my screen and get started. And I'm going to be talking from a PowerPoint discussion just to sort of try to help us stay focused. I often find that helps quite a bit in terms of just allowing people to sort of look at something rather than listen to me. So this talk is called Charlottesville's Jews, Insiders and Outsiders. And the first question I really want to pose is how can any group of people be both? How can they be both insiders and outsiders? How can they both be accepted within groups with influential power, have access to decision-making and confidential information, and also be thought of as foreigners, as strangers, different, perhaps even as dangerous? And I want to ask, what is it about American society and American values that creates this tension? How have Charlottesville's Jews responded to these tensions? Now, in the description of the talk you will all have read, I said that the Jewish story is one of educational, economic success, engagement in government, in the arts and education. But I say that it's also a story of discrimination and exclusion in times when white supremacy. So what does white supremacy have to do with this? It's an important point that I want to make tonight, and I really want you to really try to think about as material I'm going to share tonight. The most important point that I want to make is that Jews are sometimes defined as white and sometimes as non-white. And this, I would argue, is particularly salient in the South, where race has been the defining characteristic of privilege, of white supremacy. Antisemitism ebbs and flows, often in direct relationship to the virulence of white supremacy. At such times, Jews are defined as other, as outsiders, but times when Jews are fully able to assimilate, to pass, in a sense, into their largely white communities by accepting current social norms and values, they often become complicit in denying opportunities to non-whites in the community. They participated, and perhaps to some degree still do participate, in perpetuating white supremacy. This is the Charlottesville story I hope to illustrate. And right at the beginning, I'm going to talk about two distinct periods of time. First, the mid to the late 19th century, and second, the period of the civil rights movement. Then I'll conclude with a few very short remarks about today, before we open it up to a discussion. The Charlottesville story cannot be divorced from the American story or the Southern story. History in the United States evolved through successive waves of immigration. At times, the United States was more open to welcoming the stranger than at others. And the first large wave of immigration to this country begins between the 1820s and 1860s with early Irish immigrants, many of them Catholic, and then a large number of German immigrants. By 1849, in response to that, the nation's first anti-immigrant political party, known as the Know Nothing Party, was created as a backlash to the increasing numbers of immigrants. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that anti-immigrant sentiment has always been part of American history when the numbers become too large to become a threat to the population that considers itself the native population. And it's precisely at this time, in the late 1840s, that the families that I call the founding Jewish families of Charlottesville arrive. Southern Jews lived in a society in which the institution of slavery was part of everyday life. Most Jewish families adopted the mores of the South. Overwhelmingly, Southern Jews favored secession and fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. Their reasons were many. They were grateful to the part of the country that had welcomed them. They supported notions of states' rights, and many also supported the perpetuation of slavery. From the best information we have, members of the families I will talk about in a few minutes also fought on the side of the Confederacy, although I have never seen any information that suggested that they owned slaves. The Jewish community of Charlottesville took root during the 1840s and 1850s, centered around those families that came with the first wave of German immigration. This was actually the second large wave of Jewish immigration to the United States. For the most part, these families were too small in number, especially in a place like Charlottesville, to constitute any kind of a threat to the Christian dominance of the region. And I think, as many of you know, because I've talked about this on multiple occasions, a major part of the story of Charlottesville centers around three founding families. They were the Letterman family, and there's a second branch of that family. So there were two brothers who came with their wives, the Oberdorfer family, and the Kaufman family. I'm sorry, I don't have a photo of the 19th century Kaufman family, but Mortimer Kaufman turns out to have been a very important person in the life of our city, the son of Moses Kaufman. Each of these families birthed 10 to 12 children. So they are quickly evolving into a community among themselves. And as life returns to some degree of normalcy after the Civil War, Charlottesville's Jews create the basic institutions that they need to maintain religious practices and establish a viable Jewish community. In 1870, they purchased the land for a burial ground and the creation of the cemetery. And by 1882, they laid the foundations. They laid the foundations for Congregation Beth Israel. At the cornerstone laying, the local Masonic Lodge and the 3rd Regiment Band performed. The Christian community participated in the celebratory event, and the synagogue's president, a man by the name of D.H. Stern, thanked the non-Jewish community for its support. Clearly, Christian-Jewish relations were very cordial. But before this happens, before the cemetery and before the synagogue, These families established themselves in the mercantile life of the city. The Letterman store, the Kaufman store, the Oberdorfer store are the largest department stores in the town. By 1898, all Letterman brothers combined together their separate businesses to create the largest department store Charlottesville had ever seen. And these founding families become the pillars of the Charlottesville community and integrate themselves into the life of the city. Not only are they prominent and successful merchants, but they win election to the town council and later the city council. They actively participate in civic groups like the Masons, the Ladies' Aid Society, the Temperance Society. Some, like Hannah Baum Letterman, were well known for activism on behalf of the poor. And by 1875, Simon Letterman served as director of the People's National Bank. His son, Moses Letterman, helps found the Chamber of Commerce. Town council is created, it was elected. Moses Letterman is elected to that. When the first school board is created, Moses Kaufman becomes a member. And he was so beloved that when he died in 1898, the schools of Charlottesville closed for his funeral. Charlottesville's founding families are also involved in the cultural and entertainment life of the city, and their engagement in that extends well into the 20th century. Sons of the Oberdorfers and Lettermans worked with Jefferson Monroe Levy, the owner of Monticello from 1879 to 1923. He purchased the deteriorating town hall in 1887 and turned it into the Levy Opera House. And it became a center for the arts in the region. In 1896, Jacob Letterman, son of Hannah and Simon, opened the Jefferson Auditorium. But when that building burned as a result of a fire, people then returned back to the Levy Opera House. There was, and Jacob Letterman, who had owned the Jefferson Theater, then went on to create a much more popular entertainment venue called Wonderland at the end of the trolley line in Fry Springs. In 1922, Mortimer Kaufman, in 1922, Saul Kaufman, brother of Mortimer Kaufman, provided the major financial support when the city municipal band was organized. This sounds like a pretty good story, doesn't it? And in 1993, when Jeff Hantman and I began this work, and along with Carol E. wrote about this history, we called it To Seek the Peace of the City. The title of the exhibit of the same name that opened that year was taken from Jeremiah, who wrote a letter to the Jews exiled after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. Jeremiah exhorted the exiles to, quote, seek the peace of the city, for in the peace thereof shall ye have peace. Jews, he was saying, had a positive responsibility to become good citizens of the place where they found themselves. And in that goodwill, they would find their safety and salvation. What did it mean for these Jews, so small in number? What did it mean for them to establish themselves and to seek the peace of the city? This, I am really sad to say, is the part of the story that I failed to understand in the 1990s. And this is the part of the story that I have just recently come to talk about as I've become more conscious of how caste and institutional racism embeds itself in society. By virtue of the positions they held, all were involved in leadership roles in Democratic Party politics in the city. And as Southern Democrats, they supported the Redeemer cause, with the goal of ousting the radical Republicans who had been in power during Reconstruction and enforcing white supremacy. The goal of ousting radical Republicans and then enforcing white supremacy. That included policies that disenfranchised the newly freed slaves and built the edifice of Jim Crow. When a permanent Democratic committee for the city was appointed, Bernard Oberdorfer was one of 3 people appointed. When names were put into nomination for alderman and mayor, both M. Letterman and M. Kaufman were among them. Both of these men were also delegates to the state Democratic Convention. Now, Charlottesville's Jews lived only a short distance from the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond. They were surrounded by white supremacist philosophies that spawned lost cause nostalgia. In 1893, a monument to the Confederate war dead, I know we're very focused, and rightfully so, on monuments in this city, but a Confederate monument to the war dead was unveiled at the University of Virginia, 1893, long before the statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson went up in the 1920s. But this statue in 1893 was unveiled at the University of Virginia at the site of a burial ground to the Confederate war dead. A very large parade led by members of General Robert E. Lee's staff wound its way to the Confederate cemetery. The full front page article in the Daily Progress cited the Committee on Entertainment's thanks to Moses Letterman, Philip Letterman, and N. Neumann, who rendered invaluable assistance to the committee. So these families that were such scions of the community, that had been so important in the civic and cultural and mercantile life of the city, they were insiders to the city of Charlottesville. And by virtue of their insider status, they participated in support of white supremacy that so defined the South. That's one period that I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight. The other one is I want to jump now and shift our attention to the civil rights movement. What do we know about Jewish participation in our city in the civil rights movement? Well, many of the sons and daughters of the founding families had left the city by now. Others remained. Philip Oberdorfer and Mortimer Kaufman still owned the stores started by their fathers. Isaac Walters and Harry Omansky, part of the Eastern European wave of immigrants, had stores on the mall across from one another. Ellis Mopsick still owned his tailor shop, established in the 1920s. A man named Saul Weinberg, a pharmacist, owned a drugstore in town. What role did they play? Now, before I actually talk about that, I think it would be helpful to look a little bit more broadly at the South. In general, Southern Jews were decidedly less vocal than their Northern co-religionists and often were perceived to be part of the problem. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very disappointed with the failure of Southern Jews to assist in the Southern rights movement, in the civil rights movement. And he said in a 1967 letter that he wrote to Rabbi Jacob Rothschild in Atlanta, who had really been his ally, he wrote, "I think we all have to admit that there are Jews in the South who've not been anything like our allies in the civil rights struggle and have gone out of the way to consort with the perpetrators of the status quo." And in the same letter, he says, "I was greatly disappointed because we always expect our Jewish brothers to be our strongest allies, if for no other reason than the fact that they have had a common oppression." So when the Brown decision was rendered in 1954, mandating the integration of schools, it was only 9 years after the end of World War II. And in the wake of the Holocaust, knowing how many had been murdered, why would Jews not speak out forcefully against prejudice, discrimination, and intolerance? The civil rights movement presented Southern Jews with a dilemma. They understood themselves to be part of a persecuted minority. And for the most part, they were not ardent segregationists, but they had a marginal status within Southern white society and mainly remained silent. The civil rights movement sparked an explosion of anti-Semitic extremism across the South, with segregationists accusing, quote, communist Jews of attempting to destroy democratic government. One estimate suggests that the distribution of anti-Semitic literature increased by 400% in the 5 years following the Brown decision. So for the most part, Southern Jews had to, quote, fight against fear. And I put that in quotes because that is the title of a very, very fine book by a man named Clive Webb, who's written a book on the subject of Southern Jews and Black civil rights. So we might say, what was this fear based on? And here I want to return to my original thesis about race and white supremacy. Jews fought against fears of personal reprisal in their businesses. They fought against fears of personal harm because they had been aware of the fact that Jewish homes in the South had been bombed and Jewish spaces had been bombed. They fought as well for their continuing identity as whites in the South. White, therefore not Black. And they fought for their place in the hierarchy of race as Southerners. They fought for their desire to remain insiders to their communities. So I might ask, why was there so much anxiety? Why was whiteness so important to Southern Jews? And here I just want to quickly say that there's been a vast literature defining Jews as a race, not as a religion, but as a race. And in the 19th century, that was considered part of good anthropological science. There were numerous books published by Southerners trying to create racial types among people. One of them was a book by a man named Josiah Knott of Mobile, Alabama, in which he was a real propagandist for racial science, and he called his own book The Types of Mankind. In that book, he had a whole chapter called The Physical History of the Jews. And by 1871, that book had gone through at least 10 editions. There were anti-miscegenation laws against interracial marriage that were common from the 1870s, creating a paranoid fear of invisible Blackness. The eugenics movement, starting in the 1880s, intensified anxiety about race purity. And by the late 19th century, the idea that Jews were Black or swarthy existed both in literature and in scientific studies. In 1910, the Reverend Arthur Abernethy, a preacher, a professor, and a journalist, published a book called The Jew a Negro, in which he argued that ancient Jews had thoroughly mixed with African peoples, leaving little difference between Jewish and Negro types. That even extended to values. He said, both had little regard for truth, had no artistic taste, both were known for susceptibility to bribery, both shared a disregard for regularity, this is a quote, regularities restricting sexual indulgences. So these attitudes were pretty common, actually, into the early 20th century. And therefore, socially, Jews become separate from the rest of white society. In 1952, 2 years before the Brown decision, a political party forms in the South called the Christian Anti-Jewish Party. It was centered in Georgia, Tennessee. It later amalgamates into the National States Rights Party, and published a journal called The Thunderbolt, in which its readers were urged to reserve their wrath not for the, quote, ignorant Negro, but for the real mastermind, the Jews. Jews in Birmingham, Alabama, found that there was a local spokesperson, Rear Admiral John Cremellin, who ran for political office and argued on his platform, the Negro is the malarial germ, but the Jew is the mosquito. There was tremendous fear. There was tremendous fear across the South and increasingly across the nation about this growing anti-Semitism, this growing tendency to define Jews as a racial type. And so Jews found themselves in a position of pretty much choosing to stay silent and support the status quo. So let's return to Charlottesville. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down the Brown decision, and 1 year later, the court established the, quote, all deliberate speed requirement for ending segregation. And the ambiguity of the all deliberate speed piece created the time for segregationists to organize resistance movements. In Charlottesville, African Americans Eugene and Lorraine Williams filed suit to compel the integration of the city's schools. And in response to this and many other efforts to move forward with integration, US Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr. advocated a policy of massive resistance to block desegregation efforts. Also in 1955, segregationist by the name of John Casper, well known for his anti-Semitic views and associated with far-right organizations, including the White Citizens Councils, the Klan, and the National States Rights Party, Casper chose Charlottesville as the ideal place from which to attack school integration. He said, there would be no Negro problem without the Jew problem. Jews throughout the world are the force behind the campaign in the United States to integrate the races. He created a local chapter of his virulently racist organization called the Seaboard White Citizens Council. He attempted to intimidate Black and white civil rights advocates. Casper distributes a pamphlet in Charlottesville, but also throughout Virginia, called Virginians on Guard. And he distributes that to every member of the State General Assembly, calling on people to abolish compulsory school attendance. When he was in Charlottesville, he interrupted a meeting of the Virginia Council on Human Relations, and he sort of pushed his way into that meeting, shouting, "We have declared war on you." He was also believed to have been behind some of the cross burnings on the lawns of civil rights activists. In July of 1956, the federal district court judge, John Paul, ordered the segregation of Charlottesville's schools to cease, effective September of that year. In response, the Commonwealth of Virginia then sues to halt integration. And in response to that, the Charlottesville chapter of the Defenders of State Sovereignty grows exponentially. Charlottesville is suddenly at the center of the desegregation struggle in Virginia. This part of the story, I think, becomes all the more interesting as it relates to Jewish responses. The forces supporting massive resistance descend on Charlottesville to collect signatures on petitions to resist integration. A prominent white liberal journalist writing for the Washington Post reported that the petition seekers were jubilant about the numbers of people that they were getting to sign. For the most part, it wasn't difficult to get people to sign. Although one petition carrier reported that the mayor of Charlottesville, Saul Weinberg, was one of a handful of people who refused to sign that petition. So who is Saul Weinberg? We've heard of so many of these other Charlottesville Jewish merchants, but Saul Weinberg was actually a name that was quite new to me. Weinberg serves as Charlottesville's mayor from 1954 to 56, right at the height of the massive resistance movement, but right after the Brown decision. He was born a Jew, but he married a Southern Baptist, and the family joined Christ Episcopal Church. Although he did not worship as a Jew, he never converted to Christianity. And he serves on the Charlottesville City Council before he's mayor, and he's also on the school board. He's well connected with memberships in the Lions, the Elks, the Masons, the Shriners, the American Legion, and even Keswick Country Club. As a pharmacist, he owned and operated the Monticello Drug Company on Main Street. Had become an insider despite his Jewish sounding name and Jewish ancestry. And he seems to have had no difficulty speaking up and speaking out for what he believed. His outspokenness at a time when others kept their heads down is really impressive. But he was also not really targeted as a Jew. So Charlottesville, as I said, becomes a center of resistance to integration for the most part. And there are various people who sort of try to stoke fears of anti-Semitism. One of them is a journalist in Richmond named James Kilpatrick, who suggests that the ADL was responsible for fanning the flames of anti-Semitism because he said the Richmond office of the ADL had sent pro-integration literature to an NAACP workshop in Charlottesville. And that clearly sends shockwaves through the Jewish community, both of Richmond and the Jews in Charlottesville, who are well aware of Kilpatrick's attack. So Charlottesville's Jews are not, one last thing I want to say is that the same year, 1958, John Casper published a sheet called Segregation or Death. He claimed that Jews had clandestinely assumed control of the apparatus of political power in the United States in a Zionist plot to undermine the democratic foundation of the United States. He claims that 3/4 of the federal judiciary attempting to force integration on the South were Jews who should be hanged for treason. As an aside, I might just say it's no wonder then that Southern Jews were not ardent Zionists, because they were terribly fearful of seeming disloyal to the United States. So Charlottesville's Jews were not on the front lines in the legal and political struggles to integrate the city. They had no full-time rabbi to speak for the community. There was a rabbi in town who was the Hillel rabbi named Ray Krinsky, who does seem to have been somewhat involved in anti-segregation activities. He's here between 1953 and 1969. But most people in the community don't even seem to be fully aware of those activities. In the 1960s, there are also activities that continue to strike fear. There are swastikas that are painted on Westminster Presbyterian Church, on St. Paul's Memorial Episcopal Church, and even on the synagogue itself. Slogans like "Jews go home" appear on a university building. No wonder then that most Jews in the city kept silent when it came to the Southern Civil Rights Movement. They felt the risks were real. They kept silent not only in response to the anti-Semitic attacks, but also to the virulent anti-Black and pro-segregation activities. So that's a second example of the way in which Jews by the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s did not really perceive themselves as insiders to the city and as outsiders, or at least as fearful of the implications of anti-Semitism. They chose to be quiet and silent and not take great risks. So let's talk just a little bit about today. First, I want to ask, why is it so important to go over this history? Why is it so important to think about these different examples that I've given you? Well, it seems to me that we have passed the 50th anniversary of some of the most dramatic changes in law that the United States has witnessed. The end of segregation, efforts to protect voting rights and equal rights under the law, yet there's clearly been a resurgence of voting suppression, a dialing back of civil rights legislation. We've been witnessing day after day after day, year after year after year, the killings of innocent Black men that continue to reveal to us that racial hatreds and disparities exist in our society in unacceptable ways. And there is a long history of that. Black Lives Matter reminds us that we're still a long way from any kind of equality, and that white supremacy existed, racism existed, and clearly continues to exist today. We in Charlottesville do not need to be reminded about white supremacy and racism and anti-Semitism. We all remember the chants, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." And more recently, on January 6th, with the insurrection of the Capitol, a man from Newport News, Robert Packer, who showed up in a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt. We do not need to really be reminded, perhaps we don't know the details, of the rise of hate crimes in the United States, and particularly the large percentage of hate crimes against Jews, the largest percentage of any religious group in the country. So we do not need to really be reminded of the anti-Semitism or of the racism within our society. I think what we need to ask ourselves is, what are we doing about these things? What are we as a community prepared to do to combat this ongoing and intransigent ways in which white supremacy and racism continues to afflict our society? There are many among us who are act in active ways to make a difference. And I don't want to name names because I know I'll leave some out. but just a quick look about some of the variety of ways in which people are involved in social activism within the city. We have every right to be justifiably proud of these involvements and engagements. But the question that I sort of am asking myself, and I hope some of you will want to talk about, is what else could we be doing? What else could we be doing to really make a difference in the life of the city?